Welcome to Basically Detectives. This time around, we'll be looking at episode 4 of Making a Murderer, the Steven Avery Case. Hello lambs, co-host Rick is back yet again for another awesome, amazing, mold-breaking episode of Basically Detectives. Thank you for joining me on this wonderful day. I hope you're having a good day as well. Before I get started, please head to our Patreon, murderandlove.com, give us an SOS, all the usual stuff. You know how it be. There's no time for any of that right now, though. So I'm going to start off by giving our usual disclaimer. Basically Detectives is not a summary show. We are not a review show. We do not tell you the entire plot. Please, I'm begging you. It's been long enough. You've had plenty of time. Please, start watching the show so you can watch along with us. At the same time, as a small update, I will also be returning to the Night Stalker show pretty soon. So you'll have 2 shows to catch up on while you're listening with us. So, without further ado, let's get started on episode 4 of Making a Murderer. So, this episode seemed to focus more on Steven's nephew, Brendan. And if you recall from the last episode, Brendan was seemingly, in my opinion, coerced into, confessing that he helped Steven, his uncle, murder this young woman. Now, at this point, in the beginning of this episode, Brendan gets a new attorney, and the defense attorney believes that Steven forced Brendan to do these horrible things to Teresa that, as we said previously, the details go way beyond what actually happened to the victim. Now, Steven's defense attorneys, they see Brendan's quote-unquote confession as just another thing that the state can use to pile charges against Steven. And they even explain, that the more charges you have against somebody, the easier it is to convict them. One thing that I didn't actually, think about before I saw this show was when you're convicted of multiple charges and you're in court, the jury essentially has to agree whether you're guilty or not guilty over every single charge. I never thought about that, lambs. I'm ashamed of myself. I never thought about that. So the more charges that they could stick on Steven Avery, the easier it would be for them to, throw him in jail and lock away the key. So that seems to be what Steven's defense believes is the angle here. And Steven himself, in a phone call with one of the news outlets, which is probably a huge mistake on his part, not that he was aware of that or maybe even thought about it, but when he spoke to a news outlet, they asked him what they thought about Brendan and how he viewed Brendan's quote-unquote confession. Steven, flat out said, I don't blame my nephew. I feel like he was coerced. And the news reporter asked Steven, she said, do you think Brendan is smart or intelligent, something along those lines? And Steven said, no. Long story short, Steven said no. Oh, the media took that and rolled with it. They think that Steven was making some kind of threat to his nephew saying, you're not that smart, blah, blah, blah. That wasn't the case. If you listen to the actual conversation, that's not what Steven meant. They're putting words in his mouth. I can't believe that. Well, I can believe it, but it's awful. And with the topic of Brendan, just to reiterate, Brendan is learning disabled. His family continuously describes him as a slow learner. The defense attorneys consider him to be learning disabled. Steven and the other family members say that Brendan isn't quote-unquote that bright, stuff like that. Brendan is being told that his confessions are inconsistent. Brendan doesn't even know what the word inconsistent means. And that's not a joke. He honestly asks his mom, what does inconsistent mean? And he seems to have his default assumption is that they're saying what he said isn't true. Now remember, lambs, I said last time I truly believe that Brendan was coerced into saying what he said. So, for him to jump to conclusions and believe that people think what he's saying is false, I think that leads into the theory of he didn't really do any of this. He was just saying it because he thought he had to when he was talking to those cops. And it cuts to Brendan and his defense attorney. They're attempting to, I guess, persuade the judge that Brendan was indeed coerced and that his confession should be wiped from the record. Well, the judge deemed his confession a quote-unquote voluntary statement. I don't know what that means, guys. I get what they're trying to say. Brendan spoke those words out of his mouth. He made the decision to speak those words out of his mouth. But he's a 16-year-old who's a little slower than most people. He doesn't have the tools or the capabilities that a regular, everyday person does, especially at that age. He was spoken to without his mother present. He was spoken to without a lawyer present. He didn't know to ask for any of that stuff. He was backed up into a corner by these freaking detectives looking for information. And they got their information, that's for sure. But, so, on top of that, too, the defense attorney who was assigned to Brendan had an investigator speak to Brendan. And he was asking Brendan, I need you to fill out this apology form, and are you sorry? If you're sorry, write it down on the form and fill it out. If you're not sorry, write it down on the form and explain why you're not sorry. And then if you are sorry, detail what happened and why you would never do it again, and blah, blah, blah. And it seemed like some kind of, I want to say formality, but honestly I don't really know how to describe what this process looks like. Maybe one of you lambs can tell me if that's really a process they go through. Like, it was a form that had a box that said, I, insert name here, am very sorry for what I did to, insert victim name here. Or there was another option that said, I, insert name here, am not sorry for what I did to, insert name, blah, 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 or whatever. Maybe one of you guys can clarify what that actually is and what it means for us. I digress. Anyway, I noticed that when Brendan filled out that form and he gave details of what happened that night, by default, Brendan gave details of a night that was pretty much just him going home. Maybe, I think he said he saw a friend of his boss or his friend's boss called to see what was an update or something like that. He played PlayStation, and then I think in the confession he mentioned getting the mail and then going to see his uncle, and that's it. He never mentions the victim at all in this statement. And the investigator, you can see it in the episode. The investigator leans forward and he's like, hey, Brendan, you didn't talk about Teresa. You left out Teresa. What happened to Teresa? And then Brendan, I'm assuming, rewrites his statement to add in all the stuff he said. And that's the thing, too. I think he was thinking up that stuff on the spot when he, quote-unquote, confessed, because he doesn't seem to have a cohesive understanding of what happened that night. Like, if you assume that he did do that stuff, and he says, oh, we did this, and we did that to her, and this happened to her, and then we did this, blah, 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 he never keeps that consistent. It's inconsistent. So I think he's having, because it didn't really happen, I think he's having trouble remembering what he said. Because he's not saying it based off of a fact. He's saying it based off of what other people wanted to hear. I digress. Anyway. The thing that really bothers me, too, is the instructor. He tells him, he's like, after Brendan, writes out his statement and confession, the investigator says, draw a picture of you hurting the victim. Draw a picture of you having sex with the victim. Draw a picture of the victim. He's telling Brendan to do all this stuff. And again, it feels like somebody is feeding him a confession. I keep getting that vibe from this whole thing. It's just someone feeding him a confession. And in all honesty, this whole episode to me felt like it was about that. It was about Brendan's struggle with the confession and how he couldn't decide whether or not he should follow it. He has so many phone calls with his mom, it seems like, where he's telling her, I don't understand, I don't want to go to jail, I don't get this. He's asking his mom questions about how she talked to the attorney, blah, blah, blah. He's telling the defense attorney that he'll, quote-unquote, admit to his mother what he did. And he seems to jump back and forth between committing to the confession and then telling his mom he didn't do it. Which, again, to me, seems like he doesn't understand the nuances of, A, what he's saying, and B, what these people are looking for from him. I don't think he understands the gravity of the situation that he's in, and that's very heartbreaking for me. For someone who doesn't know any better, to not know better and not be given the tools to understand and have nobody help him in the way that he needs to be helped, it's very heartbreaking, and that's terrible. I can't believe it. And not to mention the fact that the longer this goes on, the more it kind of tears apart Steven Avery's family and kind of puts them against him. I won't get into it here, but Brendan's defense attorney does break down that from a certain angle, Brendan continuing to commit to this confession or trying to rescind the confession, that's either going to make or break Steven Avery's case. If Brendan tries to take away his confession and get it revoked from the record, or however you want to pronounce it, or however you want to use the lexicon, that can make things very easy for Steven Avery, or it can make it very hard for Steven Avery, depending on what they do. It's interesting stuff. I can't wait to see and hear what you guys think about everything. I know I don't personally respond to comments a lot, but I do read them. I do enjoy seeing them and seeing what you guys think. I do take what you say into account when we're doing episodes. Now, on a side note, Steven's fiancée, she had some evidence where she was in jail at the time of the supposed murder. She was under a DUI charge, so she was in jail. She had called Steven around the time that this murder supposedly took place. And she spoke to Steven, I believe she said for about 20 minutes, around like 5:30. And then she called him again for a little while, around like 8 or 8:30, I think. I can't remember the exact times, but it was like later that evening the same day. So, he is totally just on the phone with her when this murder is supposedly taking place. I don't buy that. If he's on the phone with her, and this phone calls are recorded because she's in jail. All of her phone calls going out are recorded because she is in jail. So you can hear Steven on the other side of the phone talking to her. There's no conniption in the background. There's no bullcrap happening that you can hear. It's just Steven being a guy talking to his fiancée. But anyway, one of the officers, I think he was an officer. I can't remember if he was a detective or an officer. But Pete Bates, I think his name was. Pete Bates, something like that. He was explaining how, from his point of view, the search warrant, or the search of Steven's property, when they were trying to find evidence against him for this murder, was insane. He said that it was messy, it was unprofessional. He explained that normally when you get a search warrant, or an order to search a property, you go in there, you search the property, and then you're done. However, on this occasion, they went in, they searched the property several times. I think he said the actual number was 7 times. And normally, the only reason that you go back and look for something is if you think you missed it, which doesn't speak very well to the credibility of the sheriff's department. Now, on the flip side, he too mentioned it's really shady that they found quote-unquote evidence against him. And it's like, if it was in such plain view when you found it, why was it so hard to spot it the first 6 times you did this? And another thing he said that kind of caught me off guard was that the keys they found only had Steven's DNA on them. Why do the keys not have the DNA of the victim? The victim owned these keys for years, used them every day of her life, for however long she owned those keys. And her DNA is nowhere to be found on these stupid keys. Just Steven Avery's. That's very fishy. Even Pete said, it's like they scrubbed the keys and tried to just, cake up Steven's DNA on there. And also another problem that they have is the fact that Steven's blood is everywhere. We'll get back to that later, though. You guys know what I'm talking about. Hopefully you actually watched the episode, and you guys know what I'm talking about. One of Steven's defense attorneys even explains that Steven owns, or at least lives on, an auto salvage yard. They have equipment there to dismantle, destroy cars. If Steven killed this woman and wanted to hide her car, all he had to do was put it in the crusher, you know? He didn't have to put it on the opposite side of his salvage yard where it's easily findable. Steven had the means to get away with this and didn't do it. He didn't take the effort to, you know, if you look at this as Steven did it, he took advantage of none of his resources. If he wanted to hide that car, he could have threw it in the crusher. He could have crushed that car into little itty-bitty pieces. He could have tore it apart. He could have done so many things. He had so many options at his disposal of how to get rid of that car. But he did none of those. That doesn't make any sense. And it was at this point in the episode where, you know, Brendan tells his mom he guessed, quote-unquote, guessed during his confession. And, again, I say, heartbreaking. Brendan didn't know what was going on. Now, another angle, something else that's going on at this time, Steven's fiance, she's on probation right now because of her DUI. She gets caught drinking, and part of her probation is to move away, to stop drinking, to get herself a job, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. Sadly, though, she gets arrested a lot because she's not supposed to have contact with Steven. She's not supposed to be drinking. This whole situation, though, just kind of takes its toll on her, and she just straight up loses herself. And she has to separate herself from Steven, and she tells Steven's family it's over. You know, Steven has to talk to his brother, Chuck. I think his brother's name is Chuck. I'm very sorry if I'm getting that wrong, but I can't remember off the top of my head right now. But Steven talks to his brother, and his brother says, yeah, she said that, you know, they were on her, they were all over her, and she's just, you know, basically she was tired of it, and she wanted to be free. So that's over. That is another thing that Steven has lost in all this chaos. And a really crazy thing, too, that I agree with Steven's defense attorneys. It's crazy. The sheriff's department gave a statement where they say it would be easier for us to just kill Steven Avery as opposed to framing him. What does that mean? What is that? What? No. If you wanted to frame somebody, and you're in a position of power, especially a position of authority, like a sheriff, framing is the easiest route. You know, I don't agree with that statement. I am on board with Steven's defense attorney that it wouldn't have been easier for them to kill Steven. Oh, if we wanted Steven out of the picture, we could just kill him. No, that's I totally disagree with that. That is something that I really want to hear what you think. I want to hear your opinion. Yes, you, Bob. Yes, you, Diane. Tell me, what do you think of the sheriff's department saying we could just kill Steven Avery? We don't need to set him up. That is asinine, if you ask me. Now, the end of the episode for Brendan is he tries to, at some point during this, he tries to get a different defense attorney to represent him. He thinks that his defense attorney believes he is guilty, and he wants a different attorney. The request gets denied, though. Brendan does not get a new attorney from this request of his. And without going into too much detail, it's a little cringy to see the judge asking Brendan, you know, what's wrong with your current attorney? Do you get along with him? Does he make you feel something, blah, 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 yada, yada. Brendan doesn't really have a good answer for any of this. It's really just his mom. His mom said, hey, you need to get a new attorney. And again, Brendan doesn't really understand. He's just kind of going through the motions with what people are saying to him. Heartbreaking stuff, guys. Heartbreaking stuff. But again, he gets denied the request for a different attorney. However, the judge does later find out that his defense attorney was not present when that investigator questioned him and made him fill out that form and draw those pictures. So his defense attorney gets shafted. The judge is like, hey, you didn't do your job correctly, you're out of here. I don't recall if they say in this episode what happens to Brendan's defense after this. I do recall that Brendan writes a letter to the judge asking him to look at it a different way and kind of clarifying what actually happened that night. So I'm eager to see what happened after that, because I can't remember exactly what happened after he wrote that letter. But things for Brendan are just getting more and more complicated, just like they are with Steven. However, on the flip side with Steven, one of his defense attorneys decides to get a court order to review the evidence of Steven's arrest from the 1980s. Now remember, Steven was arrested in the 80s for assaulting or attacking somebody, but he was proven innocent many, many years later and let go. Remember that. They're looking for evidence from that arrest, and they discover, drum roll please, there's a vial of Steven's blood in the evidence. They also discover that there is a pinhole about the size of a needle at the top of that vial, as if someone drew out a sample of Steven's blood. Now that to me was very, very, very shady. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this kind of overview of what's going on. I hope you enjoyed hearing my thoughts on this current episode. So please, if you can, leave us a like, leave us a comment. Go to our homepage, murderandlove.com. Give us an SOS, our little shout-out system that we have there. You'll see it on the page. You can also go to our Patreon, patreon.com/loveandmurder, where we have different tiers. We have tiers starting at $1. Kai always suggests the $5 or above tiers to get the most bang for your buck. We have things like serial killer cases. We have love obsession cases. Kai and I will sometimes tell stories about ourselves to each other while you guys listen in. Give us your feedback on the personal stories and just, have fun with us. We're also working to get maybe some games going with the fans. That's all set for the future. But anyway, I am co-host Rick. Remember to always lock your doors at night, and it's all love and no murder.